Hello, and welcome to Understanding the PERA Type 2 Student Growth Calculations. This presentation was created by Valley View's Department of Data and Assessment and approved by Valley View's PERA Joint Committee. During this presentation, we will be discussing Type 2 assessments by specifically defining these measures and reviewing the process by which educator performance ratings will be calculated for the 2016-2017 school year. Let's begin by defining Type 2 assessments as they relate to the Type 2 student growth component. According to Valley View Student Growth Plan, which is in alignment with PERA legislation, a Type 2 assessment is any measure that is developed or adopted and approved for use by the school district and then used on a district-wide basis by all educators in a given grade, subject area, or area of service delivery. Examples of Type 2 assessments in Valley View include the K2 Math Screener, pre- and post-model assessments, the Elementary Locomotor Assessment, and pre-post assessments in middle and high school courses. The intention behind the inclusion of Type 2 assessments in educator evaluations centers on the importance of student learning, instructional effectiveness, and the promotion of collective efficacy amongst our educators. So, how will grade level or content-related teams' Type 2 score be calculated? A working committee within Valley View's PERA Joint Committee met with a member of the Department of Data and Assessment, as well as other staff in the district, to consider a number of models and calculations that could be utilized to determine Type 2 student growth. Ultimately, the working committee recommended, and the PERA Joint Committee accepted, the following plan. Two measures, most commonly a pretest and post-test, are administered to all students within a grade level or content area. The average or typical growth made by students on these two assessments is calculated. Then, the standard deviation, or range between growth scores, is calculated. This number is divided in half to calculate 1/2 standard deviation. Finally, 1/2 standard deviation is subtracted from the average growth to identify a new target for student growth. This target number will be used to calculate each team's student growth rating. Valley View's PERA Joint Committee created the rubric displayed on this slide to provide educators with a tangible rubric for defining each performance rating. Using the growth target derived, the number of students who met or exceeded this growth will be identified for each team. If between 80 and 100% of a grade or content area's students meet this target, this team will receive an excellent rating. If between 60 and 79% of a team's student population meets this growth target, the team will receive a rating of proficient. Teams will receive a rating of needs improvement if 40 to 59% of their students meet the growth target, and if less than 40% of students meet the growth target, the team will receive an unsatisfactory rating. Now that we've discussed the basics of the calculation, you're probably wondering what this process looks like for your students and your evaluation. Let's break down each of the steps and include hypothetical numbers to explain the process more precisely. In our example, the students pictured are all in the same grade and take the same pre- and post assessments. All of their scores are utilized to calculate the average growth for this population of students. For ease of understanding, let's pretend that the average growth for this group of students is 5. Said another way, about 50% of these students grew at least 5 points from the pre-assessment to the post-assessment. Now, let's say that the standard deviation for this group of students is 2 points. Half of 2 is 1. In order to get our new growth target, we subtract 1, which is 1/2 standard deviation, from 5, which is the average growth. Our answer is 4. So, the growth target for this group of students has been lowered from 5 points to 4 points. Using the growth target of 4 points, the original group of students in our hypothetical scenario are placed back into their assigned buildings. Then, the number of students who met or exceeded the growth target of 4 points is calculated for each team. Each building team receives a student growth Type 2 score that reflects the percentage of their students that met or exceeded 4 points of growth. If a building had 80% or more of their students meet or exceed 4 points of growth, their team's student growth score would fall in the excellent range. If a building has between 60 and 79% of their students meet or exceed 4 points of growth, their team's student growth score would fall in the proficient range. Teams who had between 40 and 59% of their students meeting or exceeding 4 points of growth fall within the needs improvement range, while a team that had less than 40% of its students meeting or exceeding the growth target of 4 points falls within the unsatisfactory range. Let's look at another example. On this slide, you will see the hypothetical pre- and post-test results for 40 students. Their individual growth is calculated and labeled as the district average, which is 5.05 points of growth. When a 1/2 standard deviation of 1.2 is subtracted from 5.05, a growth target of 3.90 is identified. The fourth and fifth columns of this example demonstrate how Valley View PERA Joint Committee's decision to create a growth target that is 1/2 standard deviation below the district average enables more students to meet the growth target. As identified in the fourth column, entitled Met Average, approximately 50% of the sample met or exceeded the district average of 5.05. However, in column 5, entitled Met Target, about 70% of the 40 student sample met the new growth target of 3.90. When the results from the previous slide are viewed by team, the number of students who met or exceeded the growth target of 3.9 is calculated. In this hypothetical example, the student growth for all 4 teams falls at or above 60% of students, but below 80% of students meeting the growth target. So, all 4 teams receive a Type 2 student growth rating of proficient. Now that we've reviewed a few practical examples of the Type 2 student growth model, let's discuss a few reasons that these steps were selected by the Valley View PERA Joint Committee for the 2016-2017 school year. As you are probably aware, teams of Valley View staff across all grade levels and subject areas have been working to create and refine our current common assessment structure. The Type 2 model selected by the PERA Joint Committee enables all staff members to be treated fairly, utilizing the actual growth of our students on current assessments rather than guessing to create a growth target or using published targets created by educators who did not provide instruction to Valley View students. Moreover, the Valley View model provides the opportunity for a larger percentage of students to meet or exceed the growth target selected for each assessment measure. As illustrated in the previous 2 slides, if the PERA Joint Committee would have simply chosen to utilize the average growth for each assessment, only about half of all students would have met or exceeded this mark. However, by decreasing the target by 1/2 standard deviation, more students will meet or exceed the growth target. It is expected that the increase in the number of students meeting or exceeding will also lead to a greater number of educators whose Type 2 student growth score falls within the proficient or excellent range. During this presentation, we have spent the vast majority of our time discussing the Type 2 calculation. However, it has come to our attention that there is some misunderstanding amongst Valley View educators regarding the Type 2 calculation that we would like to take a few moments to dispel. To begin, the Type 2 calculation does not place buildings on a normal curve, where some buildings must fall above, at, and below a defined number. As you heard earlier in the presentation, the growth of all students who take the assessment will be utilized to identify average growth. Separate growth calculations will not be completed for each building or team. This method then avoids placing buildings on a normal curve. Further, buildings are not being pitted against each other. Although a score for each team at a building will be generated, the average growth and standard deviation are calculated based on the results of all students who took both the pre- and post-test in district, not based on how students at a particular building fared on the assessment as compared to students at another building. Third, There is no expectation that a particular number of buildings must fall into each performance area. It is reasonable to assume that every team will have some students whose growth falls below the growth target, as well as some students who meet or exceed the growth target. As such, the team's student growth rating will depend on the number of students who fall into each of these categories rather than how students in another building performed. Finally, as mentioned in the previous slide, this model does not incorporate the use of previously defined growth targets. Even if an assessment has been administered multiple times previously, the PERA Joint Committee elected to utilize student performance on the 2016-2017 school year administration for the purposes of the Type 2 student growth calculation. This methodology was selected in an effort to promote fairness amongst all teams, as district common assessments are at various stages of creation and refinement. In an effort to further illustrate the difference between models like the quartile ranking system, pictured, and the model selected by Valley View's PERA Joint Committee, please consider the information presented on this slide. To emphasize, this model was rejected by Valley View's PERA Joint Committee, but is included in this presentation in an effort to demonstrate differences between the approved calculation and other models. In the quartile ranking system, the growth of each building is separately calculated. Using this calculation, each building is placed in a performance category. Please note, the numbers utilized in this example are exactly the same as those utilized previously in this presentation to illustrate the Valley View Type 2 calculation. The difference in student growth ratings is purely because the growth target was calculated for each school individually rather than for the entire 40 student population. If you recall, using the Valley View calculation, all 4 teams received ratings of proficient, while in this example, one team falls into each performance rating. Why does this occur? In the quartile ranking system, there can only be one building rated in each category, with the building with the highest average falling in the excellent range and the school with the lowest average falling in the unsatisfactory range. In the model pictured on this slide, buildings are pitted against each other, which is one of the reasons the PERA Joint Committee decided not to utilize the quartile ranking system for Valley View. Please remember that a primary goal of the PERA Joint Committee was to create as fair a system as possible. As has been mentioned at various points throughout this presentation, given the variability in assessment development and refinement, Valley View's PERA Joint Committee agreed upon the presented formula because other options would have likely led to some teams being held to extremely challenging student growth goals, while others were presented with easier, more manageable student growth targets. Using the formula described in this presentation, each team is treated uniformly. This method is intended to provide a fair and consistent evaluation process for all certified Valley View educators. Finally, please remember that the Type 2 student growth rating is only one portion of the final student growth rating, as you will also have a Type 3 SLO rating that is factored into your final student growth rating. Once you have completed all portions of student growth and have a final rating, your overall student growth rating is combined with your professional practice rating for an overall summative rating. The chart on this slide shows the overall summative rating that you can reach based on various student growth ratings being combined with the professional practice rating. Thank you for viewing this presentation. We hope that we were able to answer most of the questions or concerns you had regarding the Type 2 student growth calculation. If you have any additional questions or concerns about this presentation or the Type 2 calculation, please feel free to contact the Department of Data and Assessment.